Hi everyone, and welcome back to Wine Unpacked. My name is Holly, and for the next hour or so, I'll be your tour guide as we continue our journey, getting our heads around some of the amazing wines this world has to offer. This month, we're not looking at a specific grape or region. We're going to take you on a slightly different journey, starting deep underground and finishing up in your glass. We're going to be looking at how grapes grow, how they get turned into wines, and some of the things that wine growers and winemakers can do along the way, or choose not to do, in order to make the wines taste the way they do. Some of the concepts are a little bit technical, and you don't necessarily need to know the details of everything. But a lot of the terms we'll be covering are printed on bottles, so having a basic understanding of them can help you to pick out better bottles that are more to your taste. Today we've got a mix of a few different colours on our labels. Any with pink or yellow labels should be slightly chilled, so pop them in the freezer for 10 minutes if you need to before we get going. You can leave wine number 6 in the fridge if you like, as we won't be tasting that one until the very end, and it will be great straight from the fridge. Once your wines are ready and you have a couple of glasses in front of you, we're ready to get started. Because we're covering quite a few grape growing and winemaking techniques today, let's start with a quick overview of the whole process before we go into some more specifics as we go through each wine. First of all, to make wine, you got to grow some grapes, which takes place in the vineyard. The main grape vine structures sticks all year round, but the grape growing process starts early in the spring with bud burst when the new shoots start to grow. Over time, these shoots grow and develop inflorescences, which are the bits that turn into flowers. The flowers that become fertilized turn into tiny grapes, which over time grow, change color, ripen, and in late summer or autumn, these grapes will be big enough to pick for harvest. Once the grapes are picked, they travel from the vineyard to the winery, the winemaking building, which is usually on site, but could be the complete other side of the region or even in a different country. The winery is where the winemakers face a dizzying number of choices as to how to turn those grapes into their final wine. The grapes will go through some kind of squishing process to get the juice out, some kind of fermentation process that turns the juice into alcohol, and some kind of maturation, even if it's only for a few weeks, and finally be placed into bottles, ready to be shipped out to drinkers. These choices, made at each stage, are what present us with such a vast array of wines on the shelves, all with their own unique stories to tell. Now you know some of the basics, let's get started with some of today's wines so we can run through some of the steps in a bit more detail. We're going to start our journey down in the dirt, because this is where all wines ultimately start out. Wine is all about terroir, and we covered some of the things that make a good site for growing grapes in our first lesson. The climate, altitude, aspect, proximity to rivers, mountains, seas, lakes all play a part, but a lot of what makes a good site changes from region to region. In Bordeaux's left bank, for example, the soil is very gravelly. This gravel absorbs sunlight during the day and raises the vineyard temperatures at nights. If this soil wasn't here, then Cabernet Sauvignon, the main grape they grow, wouldn't ripen. Shoot across to the Napa Valley in California, and a lot of the time they have the opposite problem, meaning they're reliant on cooling fogs and breezes to keep their vineyards cool, to keep the acidity in the grapes. In areas where it rains a lot, you definitely want free draining soils to stop the grapes being drowned. But in areas where drought is an issue, soils that retain water better, like clay, can be a lifesaver. All these different elements coming together to impact the perfect terroir can mean that some grape varieties will only have a handful of perfect regions around the world to show them at their absolute best. And even in a perfect climate, the changing weather every year can often throw a spanner in the works and ruin a vintage. One rule, however, that is relatively universal all over the world is that if you want to make good wines, you need to make the plant stressed. If vines have it too easy, they don't need to do any work. Good, nutrient-rich soil with plenty of water means the plant is too happy. It'll put its feet up, get comfortable, and grow loads of bushy leaves, putting less energy into the grapes. This might be good if you're looking for high volume wines for the mass market, but not so much if you're looking for really concentrated sugars and flavors, which is what makes the best wine. When there's a lack of nutrients, the vine will panic. Biology kicks in, and thinking about the survival of the species, it puts all of its effort into growing a smaller number of highly concentrated grapes in an effort to attract birds to carry the seeds off to a better place. These low yields of concentrated flavor are generally what we look for when we're thinking about making high quality wines. As vines get older, their yield starts to decrease too. Another thing that gives us fewer, more concentrated berries. This higher quality fruit leads to more intense flavors in a wine. You might have seen bottles before with things like old vines or vieille vin on the label. This is the way of the producer signaling to us that the wine is from their oldest, best vines and should be intense and concentrated because of the lower yield. So why don't you pop wine number 1 in your glass and see what that does to the flavor concentration. Okay, so is there anything we get from looking at this wine? It's a pale lemon color, so that's not giving too much away. Let's give it a sniff and see what we think. It's got a really big intensity coming out of the glass. There's something really, really powerful and floral going on. Let's swirl the wine and see if we can open up those flavors and pick apart what they are. Pause here if you want to have a go yourself. I get a really good concentration of fruit aromas. Some lemon and grapefruit, perhaps some white peach and apricot. But over the top, there's this really powerful floral aroma. White flowers are where I'm headed, maybe jasmine or elderflower, perhaps a little bit of rose petal. Really great floral aromas. Let's take a sip and see what comes through in the flavor. Again, I think that fruit and floral intensity is really coming through on the palate. Some sweet stone fruit of apricot and peach is coming through for me, and I can really pick out the florality, the jasmine and the rose. But there's also a bit of rich butteriness to it. This comes from the malolactic fermentation the wine goes through while they're making it. Although it's not massively prominent, only 10% of the juice has gone through MLF. There's a really great concentration of flavors here, but what about the structure of flavor characteristics? Starting with the body, I think that this is medium to full. It's quite thick and viscous. There's definitely a bit of substance to it. There aren't any tannins in this one, so let's move on to sweetness. Even though there's a really strong concentration of fruit and flowers, there's not much actual residual sugar. This is definitely a dry wine. Lastly, on acidity, what do you think? Can you feel your acidity detectors firing up? There's definitely something happening for me, but it's not a super acidic, sharp wine. This grape, Torrontés, is a medium acidity grape. And on top of that, the malolactic fermentation softens up some of the sharp, tart acid. So I'd go with medium here. Lastly, we'll cover off the conclusions. I'd say we've got fantastic intensity with this. There's a bit of complexity too, a lot of concentrated fruit flavors and some floral elements. There's a really nice balance and an amazing finish. I think this wine is really, really good. Probably what we describe as a very good or outstanding wine. So what is this wine we've been drinking? And is there anything interesting that happened along the way to make it taste the way it does? The wine is from an area called Cafayate in Argentina. This is the country's most northerly wine region, which means it's very close to the equator. The vineyard sits at 1,700 meters above sea level. To put that in context, if you walked up to the top of the highest mountain in the UK, Ben Nevis, you'd still be 400 meters below this vineyard. Argentina as a country is super hot, but the Andes that runs down the west of the country can help cool things down. Down on the plains, the average temperature in the summer would be over 30 degrees, but the increase in altitude takes almost 10 degrees off of this, making it suitable to grow grapes with high concentration of flavour and decent levels of acidity. There's also a lot of sunlight still, especially at this height due to the increased UV rays. But the temperature never gets too hot, meaning that the grapes retain lots of acidity but balance out all the ripe fruit flavours. Fertility on hills and mountainsides is typically much lower than the lush valley floors. The rocky soil here means that the grapevines are stressed, and that encourages vines to grow better grapes. This grape, Torrontés, is aromatic, which means it's one that's likely to give off a lot of powerful aromas. And the poor quality soil, coupled with the cooling influences of the altitude, are coming together to make this a really intense but well-balanced wine. So what do you reckon? Are you a fan? One of the things you'll notice about this wine is that they make a big point of putting old vines on the label, and the year they were planted comes front and center too. These vines were planted in 1945, so they're 76 years old. This is pretty old as far as vines go, but the oldest vine in the world is still producing fruit at the ripe old age of 400. Despite the age of these vines, you might find it interesting to know that the roots don't actually belong to the same plant as the top of the vine. Broadly speaking, there are two ways to get vines to reproduce. The first is the good old-fashioned birds and the bees way, where the bees and other insects cross-pollinate two vines, creating fruit with seeds that sprout a new vine. The problem with this, however, is that there's no telling what the offspring is going to be like. There's also no way of keeping the offspring consistent time after time. Cross Pinot Noir and Gouais Blanc, for example, and you might get Chardonnay. But you might also end up with Gamay, Aligoté, or something else entirely, all of which come from these two same parents. As is the case with humans, grape brothers and sisters can be totally different from one another. So winemakers have historically favoured the second approach, which is cloning. To do this, they cut a chunk of the plant off and pop it in the ground to let it grow roots. That sapling will flourish into a vine. Most of the time, a perfect clone of the parent plant, giving winemakers the grape variety they're looking for. This was all going swimmingly until in the late 1800s, a vine-eating bug called Phylloxera came over from America and wreaked havoc on European vineyards. All the plants kept dying until someone figured out that the only way to protect the Vitis vinifera vines, that's the name for the European vine species that we use for making wine, was to graft or fuse together the top bit of the vine with the roots of a different American vine species. The American vines were so used to the bugs that they weren't harmed by them, but their grapes don't make delicious wine. So voila, Frankenwein with the best of both worlds. After a difficult time for many grape growers, all the vineyards could be replanted with these newly grafted vines. This method is how the majority of grapevines today are planted. So whether they're old vines or not, you're probably looking at American roots with a European top. There isn't actually a legal definition for how old an old vine is, but generally you wouldn't find anyone whose vines were much younger than 25 years shouting about it on the label. Anyone putting old vines or the French vieille vigne on their label is probably more quality focused than volume focused. So it usually works as some kind of guarantee that the wines are going to be relatively good, or at least that the winemaker is trying hard. One thing you won't find on this bottle is anything claiming the wine to be organic. But if you look up the winemaker online, you'll find that they make a number of different wines, and a few of them are organic. And there's a lot of references to them practicing organic methods. So what's going on here? Well, to make a wine that can be certified and labeled as organic, a vineyard has to follow certain rules and regulations. To be labeled as an organic wine, the grapes must be grown organically, and the process followed in the winery must be organic too. You might find wine labels that say made using organic grapes, which means that they farm organically, but might use too many preservatives during the winemaking process to get the full certification. Organic practicing means that the vineyard follows all of the principles required to make an organic wine in the vineyard and winery, but they haven't applied for the official certification. Does it make the wine taste any different? The jury's still out, and I wouldn't be confident picking out an organic wine from a non-organic one. It's definitely better for the planet, though. One thing you might have heard too is that organic wines give you less of a hangover, and there's actually some truth to that. Sulfur dioxide is one of the culprits for hangovers. In organic wines, they're required to use far less of it, meaning you might wake up in the morning feeling slightly better than if you drank a non-organic wine. Cheers to that. If you want to pop your wine back into the bottle or leave it to one side for comparisons at the end, we're about to move on to the next wine. So this wine bottle says it's sustainable on it. And what exactly does that mean? Well, it's not actually legally defined, but in practice it means that the vineyard is putting in some effort to make the wine in a more sustainable way than normal. In different vineyards, this means different things. Some might put it on the bottle because it sounds good. But this wine has some credentials on the bottle from an organization called Terra Vitis. This doesn't have any strict legal definition. It's a group of French winemakers who share similar values, who have created a club with certain rules. If you follow the rules, you get to use their badge on your bottles. This includes things like using less water and only using chemical pesticides and herbicides as a last resort. It also extends to an ethical approach to their workers and community. These are all things that you'd expect any winemaker calling their wine sustainable to be doing. Does this have any impact on the flavor? Again, maybe, maybe not, but drinking fewer chemicals is always a good thing. And looking after the planet should definitely be one of the key aims of winemakers, as they're so dependent on it. So let's have a taste. Okay, so obviously we're looking at a red wine, and looking at the color, say we're probably towards medium purple. Have a quick sniff and see what we think of the intensity. It's not crazy powerful, but there's definitely a bit of something there. I'd say we're looking at medium intensity. Now swirl and sniff and see what you can pick out. I get a lot of red fruit and a little bit of black. Say some strawberries and raspberries. Bit of cassis or blackcurrant, maybe red cherries or even some blueberries. With all these aromas, there's something else going on, which you might be able to pick up on. It's slightly confected. Like with the strawberries, they're not fresh strawberries or even cooked strawberries. They smell almost like the Haribo giant straws, or maybe the jam equivalent of each of the fruits. Perhaps a slightly synthetic, almost bubblegum flavor. I don't pick up any secondary or tertiary aromas with this wine. It's really fruit-focused wine. So let's take a look and see if we can pull those out on the palate as well. So as we expected, there's a lot of fruit going on with the palate of this wine. I'm detecting a lot of really juicy fruit and some of these confected flavors of the fruit sweets or jams. So what do we think of the flavor characteristics or structure? Firstly, with the body, I think this is medium despite the really vibrant color. With tannin, there's a little bit of something there, but they're really subtle and very smooth. I think we could definitely go for low. These silky tannins combined with the body give the wine a softness. This is partly because of the winemaking technique they're using, but we'll come onto that in just a sec. With sweetness, we're definitely dry. And moving on to acidity, I'd say that my acidity detectors are kicking off. This would definitely be a medium to high acidity wine. Lastly, what are our conclusions? What do you think of the wine? That's the most important thing to think about, but once you've decided on that, have a run through the list to see where you'd place it from a technical standpoint. I'd say medium intensity. There's some good variety with a number of fruits, but not many other flavors from the second or third wheel. The balance is good and the finish is all right. It hangs around for a decent length of time. It's a good wine. It's delicious. I mean, I'd happily drink this, but not exceptional. Although it does do a great job of demonstrating some of the concepts we'll be running you through now. So, what have we been drinking? Well, this is a Beaujolais. You've probably drunk one of these before. They're technically part of Burgundy, just a bit further south, but really it's their own region making their own very distinct kinds of wine, made pretty much exclusively with this grape, which is Gamay. There's a bit of a hierarchy in Beaujolais, which we'll whiz through quickly. It's useful to know, but it's not the main point of today's lesson. Firstly, you have your Beaujolais AOC wines. These are made wherever in the region, but generally in the flatter, more fertile land in the south. These are easy drinking, everyday wines. Then you have the village wines, a bit of a step up from the everyday AOC, but still pretty affordable. Next, you have your Beaujolais cru wines, Fleury, Morgon, and Moulin à Vent, to name a few. There's 10 in total. The yields are smaller, the grapes more concentrated, and the granite soils up here mean that those vines have to work harder to get nutrients. These wines are more structured and serious, and are definitely meant to stand up to some aging. There's also another wine style from this region called Beaujolais Nouveau. These wines are rushed through the winery as quickly as is legally possible and shipped out to the drinking public. While they're made using the same techniques because they spend so little time macerating, fermenting, and aging, the wines are bright purple, super fruity, and relatively low in alcohol, and lots of fun. The grapes are harvested in late September and are released for sale on the third Thursday of November every year. That's ridiculously quick for a red wine. The day they're released is called Beaujolais Nouveau Day, and in the region, it's a big old party. A lot of people still only associate Beaujolais with this fun but cheap style of simple wine, which was prolific way before my time. But honestly, there is so much quality and value in the area, especially with the cru wines, that's definitely worth exploring. But back to today's Beaujolais, and what has the winemaker done to make it taste the way it does? Well, in order to get this unique silky texture, the sweet fruit aromas and the low tannins, they use a process called Carbonic Maceration. They don't use it everywhere in Beaujolais, but it is very common. The process needs whole bunches of grapes to work, so how they harvest is important too. The majority of wine around the world is mass-produced and high volume, and they use as much mechanization in the field and winery as possible to keep costs down. With the harvesting, a tractor will travel through the vineyard, over the vines, and shake the grapes off into the hoppers of the harvesting machine. With smaller volume quality wines, while some producers opt to use tractors and mechanical harvesters, many prefer to hand harvest because it preserves the quality of the grapes. With carbonic maceration, growers have no choice but to harvest by hand because they need the whole bunches, and machines aren't clever enough to do that yet. Once the bunches have been picked by hand, they make their way from the fields to the winery, and then the carbonic maceration process starts. As we covered back in our first lesson, you can actually make white wine out of white, red, or black grapes, but red wine has to come from red or black grapes. With a white wine, the skins are discarded once the grapes are pressed. With regular red wine production, you ferment the wine on the skins, meaning that all the colour and flavour from the skins are extracted. The problem with this method for making a regular red wine is that it also tends to extract a lot of tannin, and that's not what they want with Beaujolais wines. One option would be to reduce the amount of time the grapes are in contact with the skins, but this means you don't get as much flavour or colour. So what they do instead is pop all the whole bunches into a sealed vat, cover it with CO2, and let the natural yeasts already on the grapes do their thing. The grapes start to ferment from the inside out, and when they get to about 2% alcohol, they burst and release all their juice. This juice is really rich in colour and fruit flavour, but not tannin, because the juice has had less contact with the skins of the grapes than normal. Once this has happened, the juice, or must, continues fermenting up to 13.5% alcohol, which is what we have here. This gives us really juicy, fruity wines with tons of flavour, that awesome purple colour, and not so much tannin. So if you're not into tannins, Beaujolais could be just the wine you're looking for. The wines often have a bubblegum and sweeties kind of aroma. So if you're smelling that in your wine, there's a chance that some kind of carbonic maceration has just gone down. So what do you think about this style of wine? Are you a fan of the big fruit flavours? Wines like these are great to drink on their own because they're so fruity and fun and low in tannins, but they make the perfect lunch wines. Think Parisian bistro with steak tartare and salad lyonnaise. You can also drink them slightly chilled, so they're a great spring and summer wine when you're looking to eat outside. A lot of people will have drunk a cheap and cheerful Beaujolais before and enjoyed it, but dismissed it as an easy drinking wine. But there are actually some really fantastic wines from this region, so it's worth checking out properly. This producer, Domaine Chermet, make a range of different wines at different quality levels. They make some of the fancy crus from a number of different sites they have in the area in the north, but also a lot of really good wines from the wider Beaujolais AOC region, like this, as well as some of the young, fun Beaujolais Nouveau wines as well. So with Beaujolais, we're looking at carbonic maceration that avoids the grape skins, but now moving on to our next couple of wines, we're going to take a little bit more of a deep dive into extraction of the skins and see how that can give us some really different wines, both visually and flavor-wise. If you were doing a proper wine tasting, you'd usually start with the lighter wines and move over to the heavier reds. But because none of the red wines we're drinking today have super high tannins, they'll not coat your mouth and ruin the taste. So we're okay to jump around a bit. We've briefly covered how you make white wine by pressing the white or very occasionally black grapes, removing the skins, and then fermenting that juice into wine. We also know how to make red wine, either by pressing the red or black grapes and leaving the skins in the mix while the juice ferments, or by the cool new method we just learned about called carbonic maceration. But what if you don't want a red or a white wine? What if you want a rosé? What do you do then? Is it just a case of mixing some red wine and some white wine together until you get the shade that you want? Well, not exactly, although funnily enough, that is how they make pink champagne. Before we dive into exactly how they make rosé wines, let's pour ourselves a glass to take a look at the colour. If you've only got the one glass, you might want to rinse this one out now to get rid of some of the red wine residue. So then we're going to open up bottle number 3 and pour it in. Okay, so now this one is definitely pink. But what kind of pink are we looking at? I'd say we're probably looking at a medium to deep salmon pink colour here. Rosé wines come in all shades of pink, and the colour can often give us a hint about what's coming up with the aroma, flavour and style. Let's give this one a quick sniff to see what we think. The thing I detect most is strawberries and some raspberries too. There's something else a touch more unusual and tropical in there as well, perhaps watermelon. I think there's some herbaceousness as well, maybe thyme, mint, that kind of thing. Have a sip and see what you think of the taste. Again, I'm picking out those same flavors on the palate as well. But let's move on to the structure. Body-wise, I think we're light. We've got some decent acidity there too, but how about sweetness? Interestingly, people often avoid the darker colour rosés because they think they're going to be sweet. And they are sometimes, but this isn't the case here at all. A lot of producers today are making dark rosés that are definitely dry wines. People often default to the relatively simple pale and dry Provence style because it's popular at the moment and because people know what they're likely to get from them. They're delicious, but often quite light and delicate. This wine isn't going to win any awards for intensity or complexity either, but I think it's definitely an interesting change from the norm and would be just as fun to drink on a sunny afternoon. There are a few ways you can make rosés. The first one is to take black grapes, press, and then leave the skins for a relatively short time, just a couple of hours, giving some colour from the skin, but not too much. Whereas red wines would go on fermenting on their skins for anywhere between a few days to a few months. This is called direct press. It's how the pale Provence rosés are made, and that's how they get such pale wines because the skins hardly spend any time in contact with the juice. Leave the skins for longer and you'll get a darker style like the one that we have here today. Another method is known as saignée, which is French for bleeding. It's most often found as a side product from red wine production. You start making your red wine, then you bleed off some of the juice, or must in wine speak. This juice, that's only spent a small amount of time on the red skins, becomes your rosé. The rest of the wine has more than its fair share of skins and therefore becomes a rich and tannic red. This method generally gives you a richer colour and style of rosé. This wine is made using a method called short maceration, with the colour being left to extract from the skins for up to 24 hours before the juice is taken away to be fermented. This gives us stronger flavours and more tannins than you might be used to with a classic Provence-style rosé, and it also makes it a better pairing for food. This style is from the region of Abruzzo in Italy, where the famous red wine Montepulciano d'Abruzzo comes from. But the rosés here are called Cerasuolo, which literally translate as cherry red coloured. They're made from tannic and highly coloured Montepulciano grapes, which helps to bring us this darker hue as well. So if you're looking for something to pair it with, how about sausage and fennel pasta? Or even a plate of Parma ham and olives by the pool. Again, this vineyard for this wine is sustainable, meaning they're trying to cut down on their use of chemicals both in the vineyard and in the winery. The producer of this Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo is Giuliana Vicini, and they're based in the Italian region of Abruzzo, which is central East Italy on the Adriatic coast. This wine would set you back about £12.50 in a shop, so definitely at the affordable end of the scale and a perfect price point for park drinking. But what do you think? Are you more of a fan of this slightly richer style? If you are, stick to Italian and Spanish rosés, which are traditionally this darker and bolder style. Or there's an area in France in the Rhone Valley called Tavel, and they also make a rich and gastronomic rosé. Sticking with the colour extraction theme, let's move on to our next wine and see what that has in store for us. We're actually moving on to a wine style that is incredibly ancient, but has come back into fashion recently, and that's orange wine. You might have seen the term popping up on menus over the past couple of years, but what exactly is an orange wine? Well, why don't you pour it out and see for yourself? So, I think we're definitely living up to the name here. This certainly looks pretty orange. I'd either say a medium amber or orange colour. But how does it get this colour? Well, it's made in the same way as a red wine, but using white grapes. First we press, then we leave the grapes to ferment on their skins. Different lengths of maceration will give you different intensities of colour in the finished wine. So let's find out a bit more about it. Give it a whiff and see what you think of the intensity. Now, you should definitely get a big hit of intensity here, but very different from any of the other wines we've tried so far. Give it a swirl to try and open up the flavours a bit and see what you can find. For those of you who've never drunk an orange wine before, this might be a bit unusual, but don't worry, we'll break it down bit by bit to help you understand what's going on. First of all, you might notice a bit of a natural sour funk aroma over the top, a bit like bruised apples or maybe a little bit like cider. That's because as well as being an orange wine, this wine is a natural wine. More confusing terminology, I'm afraid. So what's this one about? And how is it different from sustainable and organic? Natural wine is an unregulated term, but generally speaking, it implies thoughtful farming, avoiding chemicals, a more artisanal approach, hand-picking, etc. And in the winery, it's a case of nothing added and nothing taken away. No weird additives and less sulfur dioxide, a chemical added to wines to help keep them stable and clean. Generally, the wines also aren't filtered before they're bottled either. Because of the limited filtration and the natural wild yeast that the winemakers use, you can sometimes get this slightly funky, farmy smell. Some people love it, some people hate it. But either way, it can be a little bit tricky to see past it and see the other characteristics and aromas until you've got used to it. That's not to say that all wine that's made naturally has to look or taste funky. Some of the most expensive and famous wines in the world use these approaches, and you'd never guess. This wine doesn't have too much of a natural funk going on, so hopefully you can get some of the other aromas too. I get some almond, some thyme, some orange zest, and also maybe dried apricots and some sourdough yeasty aromas as well. Let's have a taste and see what flavors we can pick out. Again, for anyone who hasn't tried an orange wine before, this might be a little bit unusual. You should be picking out some of those aromas. There's a bit of fruit there, but the nutty aromas are definitely more prominent. The wine's really got a very savoury element to it. What else do you think about the flavour characteristics? I think on the body, I'm going to go with medium to full. It's got a real richness to it, which is helped by the skin contact. Moving on to tannins, and this is an interesting one. Our wine is made from white grapes, and you wouldn't normally expect any tannins from white wines. But there are actually a fair bit of tannins in the skins of white grapes. It's just that they're usually taken out of the equation before they have a chance to get into the wine. With orange wines, because the skins are kept in contact with the juice for such a long time, we tend to get some tannins in there. There's definitely not high tannin here, and not like you'd get from a red wine, but hopefully you can still taste some low-level tannins that are coating your mouth, adding some weight, grip, and bitterness. Lastly, on the acidity. I'd say we're looking at relatively high acidity, and that comes from the grape, which is called Procanico. This grape is actually a clone of Italian grape called Trebbiano, which you might have heard of before. Trebbiano is often made into white wine, but they're generally pretty uneventful, regular table wines. In fact, the grape is often used in brandy and vinegar production rather than wine. While Procanico is meant to be a clone of Trebbiano, something went slightly wrong. Sometimes this happens. Mutations like this aren't uncommon, and while some are negative, some can be really beneficial. A mutation might make a clone particularly resilient against frost or a particular disease, for example. In this instance, it's made the clone beautifully aromatic, developing some aromas that Trebbiano would never normally have. Orange wines are one of the oldest styles of wine around. They made them in Georgia as far back as 5,000 years ago. They've been making them there this whole time, but they've only just come into popularity over here. In Italy, where this wine is from, there was a resurgence of the style in the early 2000s, and today you can get loads of Italian and Georgian orange wines online and in the shops. In Georgia, they're traditionally fermented in these giant egg things called quevri, which are clay pots that are buried underground. Although this one that we're drinking now is actually aged in a concrete tank instead. So what do you think about this orange wine? If you like it, you'll be pleased to know that orange wine is getting more and more popular. So there are loads of really great wines out there to explore. If it's not for you, don't worry, you're not alone, but maybe give them a try again at some point and see if your mind changes over time. Not all orange wines are the same, just like not all red wines are the same. They're not for everyone and they're not for every occasion, but the savoury flavours and added texture from the tannins make them really good with food. If you have them with a meal, it should take some of the tannins away and make them feel a bit more approachable. Maybe try one by the glass next time you see it in a restaurant if you're worried you can't handle a whole bottle. If you finish your wine up or put the rest to one side, we're ready to move on again. We're sticking with the colour theme for this next wine too. Surely we've gone through all of the colours already, and technically we have. But this one's made in a slightly different way, so we thought it'd be fun to look at one last variation. This looks like a red wine, but it also looks a little bit pink around the edges. Like a super dark rosé. That's because it's actually made from a mix of red and white grapes. This is called a co-ferment, and that's where you take different varieties of grapes and ferment them together at the same time. In this case, they've used both red and white grapes. This is sometimes called a field blend because the blend is happening in the field as the grapes are picked, rather than a traditional blend that happens later on in the winery. The practice isn't hugely common, but with more and more producers bringing back older production techniques, you can find more of them around than might have been the case 10 or so years ago. There are actually some really famous wines that use the same technique, but you might have not known about. Chianti traditionally needed to have a bit of white grapes in the wine, although this doesn't really happen anymore. Côte Rôtie wines in the Rhône are allowed to have a bit of white grapes in with their Syrah. Although most often, it's a funky new winemaker doing things in a slightly different way, and they can be really fun to explore. The co-ferment adds complexity to the wine. Because you've got a mix of red grapes bringing body, colour and darker fruit flavours, as well as some white grapes that can bring more acidity and aromatics. I'd say we've got a pale ruby here. Let's have a smell and see what we can find. I think intensity-wise, I'd probably call this a medium. But in terms of what we can pick out, there's a bit going on complexity-wise. I get some red fruit, some cherry, and big, fresh, juicy strawberry aromas. Maybe some cherry drops and strawberry lace sweets too. Although we can smell sweets, this wine doesn't use carbonic maceration like the Beaujolais from earlier. I get some violet flowers and blackberry as well, and a really strong mineral, almost smoky flavour too. Take a sip and see what you think of the taste. I definitely get these fruity flavours coming through. It's probably a medium in tannin, but has quite a light body. I think it's definitely dry, and we've also got a really high acidity too. All things that the red wine, white wine mix are really helping to come out with. So let's pause here and find out a bit more about this wine, where it comes from, and what the producers Vino de Anna are trying to do in the winery. It's from the island of Sicily, and the vineyard is actually in the shadow of Mount Etna, which is an active volcano. The soil in this vineyard is literally black because of old lava. Even without the volcano occasionally spewing lava into the air, Sicily is super hot, so having a north-facing aspect is actually quite beneficial for these vines, meaning that they're protected from the fiercest sun. The altitude that the slopes offer help protect against the sun and the heat too, as this vineyard is nearly 800 meters high, dropping the temperature and giving the wines a bit more acidity than it might have otherwise had. Despite these two things keeping the temperature down a bit, the climate is still pretty hot, and ordinarily a really hot climate will mean really ripe grapes with loads of sugar and a full-bodied wine with high levels of alcohol. One of the things that the co-ferment does is allow them to produce a fresh and fragrant red wine in this mega hot climate. Once these grapes are harvested and head to the vineyard, a couple of different things happen. This wine is partly aged in the vessels we spoke about earlier called qvevris, which are giant ancient amphora-like pots that were used in Georgia about 5,000 years ago, recently seen a revival in Italy. These qvevri are buried underground, which helps to keep the temperature down naturally without being reliant on electrical cooling systems. I always think there's something quite magical about wines being aged underground in the soils where they started their journeys. It's like they're being returned to Mother Earth. Some of the wine must heads to old oak bottis, which are really big barrels that can help to add some more body and textures to the wine. These separate parts then get blended back together in specific quantities to make the final wine. The reason you do this is because it gives the winemaker a bit more control. If you treat every wine the same way, especially with a natural wine, where nature can throw you curveballs in the vineyard and the winery, putting all your grapes in one basket can leave you scuppered if things don't go to plan. Separating it out means that you can blend the constituent parts back together again to give the producer the finished wine style they want. Blends are used everywhere and in most wineries. If you take a few different approaches, that'll give you a few different wines that you can blend back together to create a finished wine that's more consistent year to year. So once the winemakers at Vino de Anna are happy with the blend, they let it rest for a bit to help the wine come together. Then they put it into bottles ready to be sold. So, this is our last red for today. Well, pretty much a red. And what did you think? If you like this, check out some of the other co-ferments that are knocking around. They're more common for red wines, but they come in a huge mix of varieties, from mixes of multiple white grapes to blends of red grapes and everything in between. Again, despite this being mainly a red wine, it's one that you could drink slightly chilled on a hot summer's day, especially if you were sat by a pool somewhere in Sicily watching Mount Etna do its thing. I treat this wine the same way as a light red when thinking about food pairing. White meat such as chicken, definitely charcuterie, and maybe some of Sicily's famous caponata, which is a ratatouille-esque stewed aubergine dish with raisins. Polish off the last wine or pop the rest back in the bottle for the time being. If you want to go and grab your last wine from the fridge, this is a great time to do that. For our last wine, we're headed back to France to find out some more about the winemaking choices a vigneron can make. We're headed to this area in the northwest of the mouth of the Loire Valley, in an area called the Pays Nantais, and the wine itself is called Muscadet. Not to be confused with Muscat, which is another grape, or Moscatel, which is a sweet Spanish wine. Muscadet is made out of a grape variety called Melon Blanc or Melon de Bourgogne. There's regular Muscadet, and then there's also this special wine we've got today called Muscadet sur Lit. Before we dive in and taste it, I'm afraid we're going to throw one last piece of confusing farming terminology at you. The grapes for this wine were grown biodynamically. So an organic wine is one where the grapes are grown with minimal chemicals and pesticides in the vineyard and then produced in a winery where they've limited all but the most essential chemicals in making the wine. We've also covered sustainability, even though that one's a bit vague. They still use chemicals, but only as a last resort. And we covered natural winemaking too, which also isn't a legally defined term and therefore up for interpretation. It's similar to organic, but generally with even less nasty chemicals getting into the wine during the winemaking process and with as little human intervention as possible. So what is biodynamics? Surely we've covered everything. Well, it starts off in a similar place as organics, but it's a bit more spiritual and is based on the cycles of the moon. It starts normally enough, and the headlines sound pretty good. The aim of biodynamic farms is to generate their own fertility through composting, integrating animals, cover cropping, and crop rotation, similar to some of the other concepts and general good practice. Where it gets a little weird is when it starts to talk about the cosmic forces and various preparations that are applied to the vines only on certain days of the month when the stars are aligned, some of which are buried in animal horns before being diluted and spread around the vineyard. So our next wine's grapes were grown biodynamically. But while this is interesting from an environmental standpoint, it doesn't actually have too much impact on the finished wine. But there are other things that the winemaker and a lot of other winemakers in this area are doing to their wines that have a much bigger impact on the flavour. So let's open up the wine and see what those are. First of all, looks-wise. We're back to a white wine, back to a pale lemon, and back to a clear wine as well. Let's take a sniff and see where we stand intensity-wise. What do you think? It's not super intense. Probably give this one a medium. Now swirl and sniff and see what we think about the aromas. Let's start with the fruit. Is there anything you can pick out there? I get some citrus, probably lemon, and some green fruit too, which I'd say was apple. And maybe even pear. Maybe it's just because I know it's from near the sea, but I'd say it smells like wet pebbles on a beach. There's definitely a mineral aroma in there of some sort. Let's move on to the next wheel because this is where the winemaking technique they use here comes in. Are there any aromas from the yeast category you can make out? This is where I really start to pick out some interesting ones. I get some bread, maybe some sourdough starter. Maybe even like some of those part-baked bread rolls that you have to finish in the oven. Or even some brioche or croissant. So where do these toasty, bready, yeasty flavours come from? Well, when a wine is made, the yeast and any leftover bits of debris form little clumps which are known as the wine's lees. There are two types of lees, the gross lees and the fine lees. They're called gross because of the size versus the fine lees, but they are a bit gross too, which is why the winemakers get rid of them right after fermentation. The fine lees is the same kind of stuff, but smaller particles. There are a few ways that winemakers can get rid of these, but some winemakers opt to keep them in the mix, and that is exactly what's happening here. Because the lees are made up of dead yeast, they can give the wine complex bready flavours, as well as the increase in texture and body. To be able to put the term sur lie on your label, winemakers in the Muscadet winemaking region need to age the wine on the lees for at least 6 months to be allowed to do this. In this instance, however, the wine has actually spent 3 years on its fine lees, which is why you get some really bready flavours in the mix. Not all wines are aged on their lees. At this point in the production process, the lees can be filtered out and then just aged in different kind of vessels. So we've got old barrels, new barrels, the Quevries we spoke about earlier, and then these can be aged for differing amounts of time before they're bottled and released. But if you've ever drunk champagne, that also spends a lot of time on its lees, which is why people talk about champagne being biscuity. They also use it quite a lot with certain Chardonnays, especially in Burgundy, to add more complexity and body. But there are also a few other winemaking techniques in the mix that can disguise it, such as oak aging and malolactic fermentation. For anyone who might be thinking that they tasted some bready flavours in the last wine, full marks. They used this technique on the last wine we drank too, the co-fermented red. But you might not have noticed it because there was quite a lot of other stuff going on too, and it might not have been quite so obvious. Now, back to this wine and the structure. Well, it's got a little bit more body to it because of the lees stirring. Melon Blanc, the grape they're using, actually has a really light body. So even though it's gone for extensive lees aging, I'd say that it's still sitting somewhere between light and medium bodied. With the tannin, lees contact doesn't do anything here, so this is still like a regular white and doesn't have any tannin. The sweetness is still very dry, and that's the same for pretty much all Muscadet wines. Acidity-wise, what can you detect? My acidity detectors are firing up. I'd definitely say this is an acidic wine. Probably go with high. Now let's draw some conclusions with this wine. Intensity. I'd go with medium, although looking at specific components like the bread aromas, it's relatively high in those areas. I think it's got a decent complexity and is very well balanced. The finish is great and goes on for a really long time with that brilliant soft bread basket flavour and aroma. All around, a great wine technically, and personally I think it's great too. But what you think is more important, so what do you reckon? If you're into this wine, check out Muscadet wines more generally. Although remember it's got to say Surly on the bottle if you're after the bready flavours. Generally Muscadet will have some of the other characteristics, the high acidity for example, but not the breadiness. The biggest area is called Muscadet Sèvres et Main, but all of the others have Muscadet in their title too. The longer on the lees, the more bready you get. For Surly Muscadet, the minimum is 6 months, but wines like this can go on aging on lees for much longer. Food-wise, the classic pairing is oysters. Muscadet is right next to the Atlantic coast of France, and this coast is where the top French oysters come from. Any other seafood would work too, some prawns or white fish. Fish and chips would work a treat too, with the sharp acidity cutting through the fattiness of the batter. Or if you're looking for a snack, try prawn cocktail crisps or some scampi fries. Unfortunately, that's our last wine for today. But if you've got some final drops left over, let's do a run through of everything we tried today and recap some of the concepts because we've covered quite a bit. We started with the Old Vine Torrontés from Argentina. Here we found out about what the old vines can do in terms of concentration for wines, but also learned a bit about why poor quality soil is good for wine. We also learned that in Argentina, if you want to grow decent grapes, you've got to do it high up to escape the heat. Next, we hopped over to Beaujolais in France and found out about a nifty production technique that can produce red wines with big fruit flavours and great colour, but without the tannins that some people might prefer to avoid. We found out about sustainable practices and how, while they're not legally defined yet, they're a very important aspect of wine production, especially for the future. We then shot over the border from France to central Italy, where we found out some more about how they extract colour in a wine, how rosés are made, and how you can get a variety of colours light to dark pink, and how some of the flavour characteristics can vary with wines like Cerasuolo. Next up, we threw you a bit of a curveball with a wine that was made from skin contact white grapes, giving it the incredible orange hue and savoury flavours and characteristics that you might usually find in a red wine. While we were here, we gave you a whistle-stop tour of the differences between organic farming and natural wines, where they're similar and how they differ. Our next wine was another unusual one, a co-ferment from further south in Italy, in the shadow of the fiery Mount Etna. Here we found out about field blends of different grapes and how that can allow us to produce some light and refreshing wines, despite the super hot climate in the far south of Italy. Finishing up, we wound our way back to France and the far end of the Loire Valley, where we found out about another winemaking technique called aging on lees. We learnt all about how this method can give big, bready, yeasty flavours to a wine and add some texture to an otherwise light and acidic wine. So what did you think about today's wines? We hoped you enjoyed some of them and hopefully you learnt some good terminology to use out in the world when you're searching for delicious wines to drink. As ever, if you have any questions, please get in touch via our website or social media. We love seeing pictures of your tasting setup, so remember to tag us in any photos. That's it from us, but we'll be back next month with an exciting box of wines to help you unpack this wonderful but complex world. Thanks, gang, and see you soon.